can I get my slides up? There we go, deep learning. That's what we're going to be doing. So I don't know how I'm supposed to feel when Andrew says my talks are full of it, but we'll see how this goes anyway. Let's see, there should be some sort of a way for me, maybe down here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to cover sort of in a way that sort of goes through different imaging modalities in a way that kind of introduces you just at a high level to different deep learning approaches. And so I'm trying to lay the groundwork for, you'll see a lot of applications, as Andrew mentioned, later in the talk, or later in the session here. So our goal is to really use these techniques to find subtle patterns in the data, minimize assumptions. How many people see something in here besides rocks? Anybody? How about now? So there actually is a person in there, and it's just meant to illustrate that what we're doing is finding patterns that are actually real, that are in the data, as opposed to finding something to make up stories about. And I think you'll be convinced of that by the end of this session. In speaking of sort of flexible modeling, data-driven approaches, Thomas Edison used it as an interview question. He asked people if they would flavor their soup before they tasted it, and if they said yes, then they wouldn't get hired. His assumptions are innovation killers was his stance. And Leonardo da Vinci actually had some deep learning experience. He said the deeper the feeling or network, the greater the pain. So the basic unit just of deep learning is an artificial neural network, and essentially what we have are inputs that are multiplied by a set of weights and then added up, and then you might have something like a perceptron at the end, which gives you a 1 or a 0 based on the weights, and then you can combine those in lots of different ways to create an artificial neural network. And there's a hidden layer, and an output layer, and an input layer. The number of hidden layers can grow quite a lot. As you probably know, deep learning is very popular these days for a lot of reasons that have hit the press. So for example, it's mastered Go. It can beat the top Go experts now. Deep learning can play video games competitively with others. You can use it to do all sorts of cool things like imitate style, where you sort of combine a picture with a certain style and it creates a stylized photo, and there's a bunch of cool editing applications of it. In terms of milestones, there's been sort of ups and downs throughout the past 50, 60 years and more. This perceptron came about in the 50s. The multi-layered perceptron started here in the 80s, and it kind of got a lot of interest and excitement, and then it didn't work very well, and it subsided. Support vector machines came on, and then here's where sort of the modern deep learning age occurred, again with the same person here, Jeff Hinton. He stuck with it, and they figured out how to train these networks and do pre-training and other kinds of ways of improving the performance. And what really convinced people was this example from AlexNet, where they had a bunch of labeled images, and deep learning methods started to substantially outcompete other existing models. And you can see here where the number of deep learning methods started making an impact around 2012. And since then, it's continued to increase performance and increase the number of models that are used. And that's even old at this point. Deep learning architecture started out with a few hidden layers, up to 5 in 98. The ResNet model in 2016 was 56 layers. They tried a 1200 layer model, which didn't work as well probably due to overfitting. These days, I would say the most useful networks are in the sort of, there are a number of models that are sort of in the hundreds of layers at this point. And it's also transferred to other fields, including neuroimaging now. So, detecting subtle things from images that can predict future outcomes. For example, retina, looking at retina, looking for skin cancer, gene expression. If you look at sort of the impact of deep learning in brain imaging, you can see here it's doubling, more than doubling every year. Just from last year to this year, it's already doubled, if you're just looking at brain imaging and MRI. So how do we do deep learning, at this point it still is, in many ways, a bit of an art as well as a science, because there are many, many models. This is just a small subset of different ways that you can combine these neural networks to do different tasks, and I'll cover some of these. So starting at sort of a basic model called a restricted Boltzmann machine, and this is really just a shallow layer, but it's using something called Gibbs energy, and it's optimizing in the context of a neural network. And if we use a restricted Boltzmann machine, we can get performance in brain imaging data that's sort of comparable to what we find if we do independent component analysis. We get similar looking networks from resting fMRI data and compare it to some other models, and you get fairly similar performance. Why that's useful is because restricted Boltzmann machine is sort of the building block for deep models, and so we can then start to stack these things and get to more complex models. So here's an example where we go from a restricted Boltzmann machine at one layer to multiple layers to analyze structural MRI data. And what we find, initially we weren't sure if this was actually going to be useful, but it does appear to help in terms of, for example, classification. So here we have raw data, one layer, 2 layers, and 3 layers, and testing and training data is both shown here. And this is just testing for a difference between schizophrenia patients and healthy controls. Gray matter segmentation images are the input. And you can see it actually improves the separation for both the training and the testing data. And this is true in more complex problems. We're all trying to figure out mental illness and the right way to sort of label those data sets. But if we just use sort of standard DSM-4 labels, you can see here, if we start with, again, depth 1, depth 2, depth 3, you are getting an improved separation between healthy controls, schizoaffective disorder, which are schizophrenia patients with a mood aspect, and then bipolar disorder and chronic schizophrenia. And this, again, is structural MRI data. Another thing that kind of convinced us early on that this was useful is, we used it to sort of classify Huntington's disease from healthy controls. So here we have about 3,500 scans, again, gray matter. But then when we, and what I've done here is I've plotted just a scatter plot. This is t-distributed stochastic nonlinear embedding. It's really just a 2-dimensional representation of the output. Each dot is an individual data set. But then when we color code it by disease severity, and we didn't tell the model anything about that, you see this nice gradient here from least severe to most severe, and here are the healthy controls. So it sort of learned this information from the data without us telling it about that variable. So a variation on deep learning is deep residual learning, which is really, again, each of these things is a layer, and what we have are these sort of shortcut loops here to try to improve performance so that the error doesn't get lost in the large model and it doesn't get optimized for. And so this has been shown to work quite well in a number of problems. And we, again, have applied this to structural MRI data in the context of Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment. And here you can see various groups here. We have healthy individuals, stable MCI, so they have cognitive impairment, but they don't get worse over time, progressive MCI, and then Alzheimer's. And so we're getting about 93% separation of controls in Alzheimer's, and we're getting a reasonable separation between stable and progressive MCI of about 80% here. And importantly, and I believe this will show up in multiple of the talks later, opening up the black box, I think, is really important for brain imaging. And so you can do things to try to visualize what's going on in the weights that we fit in a deep learning model. Here is just an example of just looking at the filters for the first layer of a given model, and we can project that back onto the brain and see what is important at that layer. And there's all sorts of ways to do this. In the interest of time, I'll jump over that and just go straight to a nonlinear ICA example. So here, we basically have multiple MLPs, perceptrons, what we're doing is creating a model where we're optimizing for independence, but allowing for a nonlinear decomposition as opposed to just a linear. And we can show that it does a much better job of finding this is a ground truth, and this is the nonlinear case. And this had a nonlinear, obviously, quadratic relationship embedded within it that linear ICA wasn't able to find well, which you would have expected. And then when we looked at the real data, so the question is, is this something we actually need? And so we look at the real data, and when we remove the linear effect, we actually find several covariant gray matter components that show nonlinear relationships. Others are more linear and probably don't need the nonlinear ICA aspect. But so it does appear that there's actually some informative nonlinearities in the data that we can model with this approach. Another important area is sort of training. How do we train these models? And how do we get enough data to train these models? And so one way that's used a lot is called data aggregation, which essentially is you can take real data and then you use that to simulate realistic data that has those properties, and then you feed that to your models to essentially get them close or in the ballpark of learning this data without going through a whole bunch of data. So you kind of prepare your models and get them in the ballpark. And so if we use this kind of an approach, we actually improve performance as well. You can see here going from about 55 to 60% up to about 70-75%. One type of structure that's used a lot is called a convolutional neural network, and basically what that means is you have you're incorporating imaging information, not just treating things as a sequence. So here we have a patch, we have like a square, those can be cubes as well, and they're slid over your image, essentially something called convolution, and then you just essentially break those down into smaller and smaller blocks, and at the end, if you're trying to solve a classification problem, you might have categories here like dog, cat, boat, or bird. We can embed this convolutional neural network in the context of something called an autoencoder. So what is an autoencoder? That's something where you have your input data over here, and then you have the network gets smaller and smaller, and then in the middle here you might have sort of a code that sort of represents the input images. So maybe it's a classifier, maybe it's just a sequence. And then at the end you have at the output, you sort of expand back out, and then you get a representation of the input. And this is what the model predicts for that output. So we've combined those two concepts of convolution and autoencoding. Deep learning is used a lot on images, obviously with Google and Facebook, et cetera. And brain segmentation is a great example where deep learning does quite well. Here we've trained a sort of dilated convolutional deep network using free surfer decompositions, and we show that we get comparable and in some cases slightly better segmentations when we run it on unseen data. And the nice thing about this is you don't need a ton of data because it's using the samples or the voxels in the image, and so you can train this on 20, 30 images and you can get a reasonable performance. And we can also do this in looking across multiple surface-based ROIs and with multimodal data. And so once you train this model, now you have the model, and then to apply it to new data is relatively quick because your weights are now fixed. And so we can do essentially a free surfer quality decomposition in just a couple minutes, as opposed to on one processor it can take a half a day to a full day to run the free surfer native free surfer. Okay, so that's structural MRI. Let's pivot to functional MRI. And so here again is an example of an autoencoder where we're trying to train, say we're trying to learn numbers. And if we iterate the training, you can see that you start with sort of blurry numbers that don't look very well close to the original by about the 9th epoch, we're getting pretty close. So we can use fMRI simply as a, features derived from fMRI. So we can take a connectivity matrix or a functional network connectivity matrix, which is shown here, which we're all probably pretty familiar with. And then you can simply train on those to classify for disease versus non-disease. And here what we're doing is we're using a stacked autoencoder model to do that. I'm not going into the details. You can find the details in the paper there, and hopefully you'll be able to get the references from downloaded from the website. But using a deep model, we do substantially better than either a linear or a nonlinear support vector machine. The error drops by close to 10% when we're classifying schizophrenia versus healthy controls. And then, as I mentioned before, we can look at the various layers to see how the connectivity represents at those different layers. And red and blue represent a higher in patients versus in controls. Now, another model that has become quite popular is called generative adversarial networks, and essentially what those are doing is you've got a generator here, and we've created sort of noise data, and we're comparing it with actual data, and then this model here is trying to learn this data and create matrices that might fool the actual classifier that we're interested in here. Here we're looking at major depression versus healthy controls, and then you've got this other arm here that's basically trying to trick it. And it's actually a pretty interesting model, and it can improve performance quite substantially in a number of cases. Here we're comparing across a number of classification approaches. It's not a huge performance, but it did jump up about 5%, going from, here's linear SVM, deep neural net, and then here's the GAN model, separating healthy controls from major depressive individuals. Okay, so that's still using the fMRI connectivity matrices, but we actually have time courses from the fMRI, and so we can use, to do that, we have to incorporate the concept of time into these models, and you do that with something called a recurrent neural network. And so there you have a sequence where you're looking at sort of previous and future. Some examples of recurrent models are gated recurrent units or long short-term memory units. And using that, we can essentially incorporate a memory and try to learn from the time series information from fMRI data. Here's an example of a gated recurrent unit where we're actually giving it time courses that were obtained from group ICA or from Atlas-based measures. And we're training to separate, again, schizophrenia versus healthy controls. And I'll just kind of go through this quickly, but you can see that we again have shown that when we directly compare with other classifiers, we are outperforming, for example, the support vector machine approach. There's a small variation between different types of gated recurrent unit models that we used here. And if we compare the information from the time courses that were extracted from either ICA or a low-dimensional atlas called the AAL atlas or a higher-dimensional one called the Brainatome atlas, you can see that when we're using this sort of data-driven parcellation, we actually do slightly better in terms of our performance as well. Again, we have to go back another step and get at creating atlases using deep models as well. Here's a visualization of the results where we're seeing testing and training for healthy controls and schizophrenia patients presented on a two-dimensional plot. One sort of caveat for these is that this is really a high-dimensional space, and so that two-dimensional plot is going to be lossy, right? We've lost information, so you can't really base everything on the plot that you see here, but it can be useful to see what's going on, sort of at a high level. And then the top discriminative components here were cerebellum and basal ganglia. Okay? And then doing what we did, I mentioned before in the Huntington's data, we can do the same thing by looking at symptoms. We can look at, for example, positive symptoms. Here you can again see the sort of most severe positive symptoms are sort of furthest away on this arm, and then the least severe here are closest to the healthy controls. And that's true for also, total score as well. Okay. We can also do a sort of a dynamic prediction. So instead of focusing on predicting something about an individual compared to another individual or compared to a group, we can look at sort of time points, the sequence information in fMRI. And here we're using, again, a recurrent neural network ICA model. We've been working on trying to blend together deep models with matrix decomposition approaches like ICA because it helps, I find, with the interpretability in that we get this grouping of networks which we're trying to relax with these deep models. And so here what we're doing is we're predicting, you can predict, for example, the occurrence of a response to a task, or you can predict sleep state, for example. We've done that in this paper. Looking at predicting auditory oddball responses or predicting sleep staging data coming from EEG that was collected concurrently. And then lastly, I mentioned sort of atlas building. Here, if we use nonlinear ICA instead of linear ICA, we can start to get resting networks that are a little bit more flexible and allow us to capture nonlinear relationships that maybe would have been missed using sort of standard linear models. And this is some work that we've sort of built on and worked together with Apo Hyvrinen, basically doing capturing information using something called spatial contrastive learning to get resting networks in a nonlinear ICA decomposition. Okay, and then the last couple topics is to think about multimodal information. So here's an example where we're looking at brain structure and brain function, which obviously are related to one another, but in a complex way that we don't fully understand. And so what we're doing to try to get at that in this case is to combine something called an attention model, where here you've got a bunch of images and you've got a caption below each image. And if you attend to a particular word in the caption, you want the model to tell you where in the picture is that word relevant. Okay, so here's frisbee, here's girl, and it highlights the face of the girl, for example. And then this is an alignment model. This is like a recurrent model that incorporates time, where then you use these to do things like translate between English and French, and you might have one word go to two words, or you might have the order of the words be different. And so what we're doing in the context of brain imaging is we've got structural features that we've again extracted with ICA. So these are covariant structural networks using what's called source-based morphometry. These are our functional features. We've used a dynamic connectivity approach to essentially get we have this sort of sliding window, and then we've clustered it, and then we've identified states. When in a given subject are they in each of these states? Okay, so this is a state vector, and so the state vector is kind of like the caption in the previous example I showed you, and the structural data is kind of like the picture itself. And so what we've got is a model where we've got this sequence predictor that takes the dynamic functional network connectivity as input, and we've got this attention network that has the structural information that comes from the gray matter. And using this model of alignment, we find substantial alignment between structure and function. So there's obviously a strong relationship between the two, highly significant in terms of alignment. And also there are some significant differences between, for example, patients and controls. So if we just maybe look up here at the top for a second. So there's a strong alignment here. What we see here is that middle temporal gyri is strongly linked or aligned to state 3 in the dynamic functional network connectivity approach. And that alignment also correlates with cognitive score. So there's a lot of interesting features here, and I think we're still unpacking, how to interpret it and what it really means. But I think this kind of work is really important. And if you go also to looking at genetic data, which is even more complicated, but presumably more nonlinear as well. If we just use a simple sort of stacked neural network where we have unimodal sections for single nucleotide polymorphism array data and structural MRI gray matter segmentation data, and then we've got a multimodal layer here that combines the two, and we just look at performance, predictive performance. We see that, and this is pretty common. Structural MRI does not bad. It's in the 70%, give or take, 80%. SNP array data does pretty poorly. Very small effects. You can see a lot of overlap there. But when we combine the two of them together, we actually outperform either one separately. And on top of that, if we use this sort of relevance propagation, or we try to visualize the layers, we can see which brain regions here are most relevant to that, and we also get which SNPs and or biological pathways. In this case, we're looking at, we found the most relevant ones were involved in biogenesis of mitochondria and protein response, autophagy. Okay, and this is just a slide as sort of an extra piece where we are working on some data sharing approaches that are decentralized. And so instead of putting everything into a centralized repository, sometimes data can't be shared for either privacy reasons or other reasons, and you want the data to be analyzed at the separate sites. And so we have a software tool called CoinStack, which enables us to run the data at these different, basically you create a model, and that model gets automatically replicated and runs at each site, and then it gets aggregated centrally at a private aggregator, and then you get a group answer from that without actually ever sharing the data itself. And so within this context, we've actually built some approaches to do neural network modeling, which enables us to do deep learning as well. So this is still very much in the early phases of development. What we've got working right now are kind of the standard models for processing imaging data. We have the algorithms for the neural networks, but we haven't got them fully implemented yet. So if you want to jump in and try it, you won't be able to do that piece just yet, but it's coming. Okay, so in sum, I think deep learning is quite promising for analyzing neuroimaging data. It allows us to learn features that might be more complex from the data itself. We can do things like rapid segmentation, data fusion. There are actually a number of interesting approaches for doing things like image reconstruction and classification that I hope will be discussed today as well. We get good classification performance, although that is not always the case. Again, you should you shouldn't think deep learning is the solution to all your problems, because it has a lot of problems associated with it as well. Difficulties in training, it takes a long time. Sometimes it doesn't work as well as simpler and more easily applied approaches. And much more work is needed to continue to sort of optimize and explore and apply these in a way that sort of can be interpreted and useful for understanding human brain function. There are tons of tools out there for doing deep learning. TensorFlow is a widely used one from Google. So I just kind of list a few of them here. And that's a very non-comprehensive list at this point. We've created a little bit of software in our group. We did some work with a Python-based tool called Cortex, although at this point we're also moving more towards a TensorFlow type framework also. Thanks to the group, to my group, and lots of collaborators that we've been working with to accomplish all of this analysis that I've been showing you. So I think I will stop there, and I don't know if we want to wait for questions at the end or take some questions now. Okay, all right, so does anybody have any questions? And speak loud, or maybe we'll see if the concert hall is good enough for me to hear you. So.
Hi, very thorough, very clear talk, and to a relative neophyte, overwhelming. It looked like every single topic you described required or was demonstrated using a different kind of deep learning approach. How does one get any perspective on that if one wants to start using these tools?
Yeah, and that was intentional. I was trying to survey different approaches. I think that's kind of what I was getting at before. You can kind of identify main categories of things you want to try to do. So if you want to look at sequences, for example, you need a recurrent model. If you want to incorporate imaging spatial context, you need something like a convolutional neural network model. And if you want to do something like predicting or representing data, like translating one image to another type of image, you want to use something like an autoencoder. Beyond that, there's an infinite number of ways to configure these models, and there are new things coming out all the time. It's really hard to keep up in the field, and so I don't have a good answer on that. I think in many cases there is still, we're still learning what these models can do and how to categorize them and how to characterize them well. So there's actually a bunch of work trying to learn about deep learning models. Like we've been using things like dynamic connectivity to analyze deep learning models as well and sort of understand what they're doing. But I think that's a really good question, and it's I guess a caveat to be careful of is in these days of sort of reproducibility and replicability and the garden of forking paths, we've got like an infinite number of forking paths now that we've got these deep learning models. So you have to be really careful that you're doing things in a way that will replicate and that can be reproduced and generalized. So.
Thank you for the great talk. All these methods basically started out with Google, who has like data sets in the size of million observations. And I was wondering what kind of data set size you would recommend to have any chance to get reasonable results?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on the model you're using. So like I showed the example from image segmentation, you don't need that much data to get a good model fit for a segmentation problem, because it's using 100,000 voxels as opposed to subjects, right, to learn the models. If you're doing something likewise for fMRI, if you incorporate the time series information, you have, if you're using sort of a short TR data set, you have a number of time points now that you can learn from. So it really depends. I don't think there's one answer there. It depends on which kind of model you're using. If you're trying to classify individuals, again, more is better. I would say, you want to be in the hundreds to thousands if you can get there. To get at least something that gives you some confidence that it's actually going to work well on new data. So,
thank you.
Mm-hmm. But you can certainly run them on, 100. Yeah, it'll run, it'll work. I just don't know how. I would put a lot of confidence in there in terms of how it would generalize with that smaller number.
So I'd like some advice on constructing priors. It would seem intuitive to me that if you build priors, you'll improve the performance of your model unless you're building in either explicit or implicit assumptions that degrade the performance of the deep learning model. More specifically, I'm working and building connectomic priors using meta-analytic data. And we've shown that meta-analytic data is a good predictor of per-subject data, but are there things I should watch out for in trying to take these meta-analytic network models and use them as priors for deep learning?
I don't know that there's anything I can think of that would be specific to deep learning. It's more general sort of monitoring the influence that the prior has on the final solution, and is it actually going to allow you to capture things that aren't represented in the prior, right? And so that's kind of standard type type stuff. We've also been using things like ICA-based priors of connectivity, to in a sense enable us avoid the problem of trying to categorize or characterize everything at the end. But the main limitation there is that if there's something that's not represented at all in your priors, you might miss it. So I think if you can blend those together, where you have your things that are sort of well represented across many studies, across many individuals, by all means, I think you should use that information, but maybe also have maybe another arm that captures some things that maybe after you get that information, what's left and what might be new and innovative that isn't well captured in the prior. So, yeah.
I noticed there weren't a lot of p-values and effect sizes. And I kind of encounter this problem of how do you talk to the stats people when you're doing deep learning? And is there an easy answer to that?
Well, I think some stats people don't like p-values either. Yeah, certainly. So I actually had quite a few slides with p-values. I didn't highlight them. So I was doing, when I'm doing comparisons of models, right, to other models, we try to do statistical comparisons there. So we actually get some confidence intervals and relationships between them. You get a single accuracy out, but you can run on multiple subsets of data, and you can do comparisons, and you can get distributions, and I think that's in the end, when you're trying to make some conclusions about some data, you're going to need some statistical context, right? So just showing a picture or giving an answer as a single number, I don't think will be enough. So I think we still need statisticians. So. Thank you.